We all know that leadership can be hard, and so specifically in this episode, we want to share with you 4 tensions that all church leaders face.
Welcome back to Practical Church Planting, where in 15 minutes or less, we'll give you practical tips, advice, and encouragement to help you plant and grow healthy churches. My name is Brian Androsian. Joining me today and every other episode is Dylan Dotson, and today we're talking about 4 tensions that all church leaders face.
Yeah, so there's... as a leader, as a church leader, there are difficult things that you have to navigate, that we have to navigate.
Yeah.
And so we thought we'd just share about a few of those and some tips to think through as we go through them. Here's number 1, and this is probably especially true for church leaders.
Yeah, I would say so.
And that's this, and innovating for the future while honoring the past. Of course, we always talk about, we said it this night at New City, in fact, that the mission doesn't, what did we say? The mission doesn't change, but the method does. Yes, the gospel doesn't change, what's right or wrong, but how we go about contextualizing it does. Now, especially the younger you are, the more likely you could see or look around and say, this is not working. Now, it's easier for you if you're younger because you may not have been impacted by some of these things that other people have. And so because they were impacted when they were younger, they want to keep them going. So that's a great advantage. However, the disadvantage is to not empathize and to realize the impact that some things can have. And so whether you're a church planter or you're on staff somewhere, the rub could be, well, we need to change all these things right now because they're clearly not working. Mm-hmm. And while that may be true, if you really want to innovate and reach people and change their hearts, you can't just say, hey, I know you guys have done this forever and it was helpful for you at some point. We're going to stop now. Like, part of leading people is like getting people on board with what's going on. And so there's always going to be the tension of innovating and reaching people in a contextual way, but at the same time honoring what had happened in the past. Because it's not a guarantee anyway, but if you want people to be with you as you make changes and how you do things differently, we've got to make sure that we're honoring and we're grateful for what happened to the past, and we're not downplaying it. We're not saying it's not working that it wasn't worth it, or well, can't believe anyone still does this anymore. We have to innovate, but honor at the same time, and that can be tricky.
Yeah, I think that this can be a tough rope to walk, because I remember at a conference we went to, which I won't say the name of the conference because I don't want to call a specific person. Now, I don't remember who said it, but I remember from the main stage that there's more of a point he was making. But I remember one of the points that the guys made is he essentially said, stop trying to innovate or stop innovating or something like that. And his point was like, hey, there's so many younger church planners and pastors coming up there just trying to completely change everything and do things different. And we've lost focus of the gospel. We've lost focus of what's most important. So to a point, I in some capacity agree with what he's saying, but in some capacity don't. It's kind of a tightrope to walk where you want to innovate and you want to be relevant and you want to be reaching people reaching people where they are, but at the same time need to honor things that have worked and honor the most important things and honor the gospel, and not just try and do things for the sake of doing them, but doing them for the purpose of reaching more people, which is kind of hard to walk sometimes. Yeah,
and our primary call as followers of Jesus is to love. Yeah. And so if we look at people and say, I can't believe they do it this way, I can't believe they like this, I can't believe they're not changing the way, like that's not, there's a loving way to approach change and innovation, and not honoring the past is not the way to do it.
Yeah.
So we want to try to innovate and create change for the future. We've got to do it at the same time as honoring the past, which can be difficult, but it's something that all church leaders must face.
Yep.
Here's the second tension that we face as church leaders, and that's sticking to your convictions while empathizing with those who disagree, which is also a really big one.
Yeah.
How oftentimes are church leaders and pastors like, well, my people won't do this, or these people always complain, or I'm just trying to do this and nobody gets on board. What's happening is that there is no empathy for why people have, like a lot of times people have questions because they care about the church, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
And you haven't done a good enough job explaining it. Or, as we all know, we spend 6 months planning, praying, deciding about something, and we're excited about it, and then we announce it, and then we're surprised that there's pushback when we've had 6 months to figure this out, and people are hearing about it for the first time. And so what that means is, when you make a decision, when you have a conviction about something, it doesn't mean you don't do that or pursue it, but you do it in a way that's loving, is empathetic, and it gives people time to get on board and to follow what you're doing. And what we found is that even if they don't fully agree, if they feel heard and that you still care, they're more likely to go along with it because they know you're not just trying to do stuff for the sake of doing stuff. Sticking to your convictions while also empathizing is also a tough tension.
One thing I think that we've done okay at New City, but I think Dylan's done a good job at kind of leading us in this direction, is when people if people have questions or don't understand why we do things, or even like give pushback, we at least we try not to be so quick to jump down their throat or jump maybe as a staff to say like, well, they're just not on board or they're just, whatever, which can be real easy to do. Like you said, if you're planning this whole thing or we have this, like we just added a third service. We just added Thursday night services. We haven't seen a lot of pushback on it, but that'd be a thing that we could see that a lot of people could look at and be like, you're not a huge church. We're not a huge church. Why are you doing this? This is inconvenient for me if I have to serve, all these things. And if they were to do that, it'd be very easy for us to just immediately jump back and be like, well, look, we ran out of room and give all these excuses and, and try and defend ourselves. But in reality, most people, if they have issues, it's because they don't understand. And most of the time it's because we didn't do a good enough job explaining it or a good enough job preparing it. And so having that mindset of, hey, it's not necessarily always your fault, but having that mindset of first looking inward and saying, did I do something wrong or did I do something that would make them think this way before just immediately turning it right back on them?
Yeah, I think that's good. So again, the second tension is sticking to your convictions while empathizing with those who disagree, trying to learn what that looks like. Number 3 is making the best decision while being misunderstood. I think we've said this before. Larry Osborne, in his book, Lead Like a Shepherd, it was so good. I don't remember what chapter it is, but he talks about how one of the things he talks a lot with young leaders is this concept right here, that people will misunderstand you, but you've got to lead anyway. Yeah. And he says that a lot of people just think that means that like, we do the right thing and they just, they don't understand, but, it's not that big of a deal. But the thing he's talking about is like, they won't understand because they don't have all of the information that you have that sometimes you can't share because they have their own jobs and this is your job. Like you're thinking more holistically of like how this is going to impact the entire church and they're not, which means that he said you have to learn to live with a low grade tension and maybe even disappointment of people or disagreement that people have with you. Yeah. And your ability to lead with that in some ways determines your capacity as a leader. That we just have to understand that we have more information than other people do, and so that we've got to be okay with people misunderstanding us. And it's not because A, we can't share all the information that we can, and B, even if we can share all the information, they're not always going to still understand why we're doing what we're doing. Yeah. So learning to be okay with disagreement, not because you're being a jerk or because you haven't done the best that you can to share the relevant information as to why the church has made a decision. But being okay with being misunderstood is a huge part of being an effective leader.
I think, and you mentioned this before, but I think a lot of this comes down to people want to be heard. People want to know that if they have a concern, you've thought about it, or at least you're willing to hear it. And then even if you don't change anything, at least, they might not fully agree with everything, but at least they know that they were heard. And so I think a big part of it is if there are concerns with whatever decision you make, listen to the concerns, and I would say listen with ears or whatever, with being willing to admit that you're wrong potentially. Not every decision you need to stick with your convictions and be confident in your decisions, but not every decision you make is going to be good, and sometimes that's going to happen. But listen to people, and even if you change nothing, just being willing to sit down and listen to them and not immediately give them 6 hours worth of reasons of why this works or immediately defend, but just explain to them what they need to know and listen. And I think that really diffuses most tension.
And that's a great point too, because there's some times where a lot of people are going to want to ask these questions and you just don't have time to have a million one-on-one meetings. Yeah. So you explain the best you can, just knowing, again, that you might be misunderstood in some areas and having to be okay with it, not because you're glad that people disagree, but having to be okay with knowing in ministry, there'll be plenty of times that happens, and the better you can manage this tension, the better it will go.
Right.
Which leads to number 4, and you kind of briefly hit on this, Brian, is being confident in what you're doing while being humble enough to continue to grow. So this was a big, I think I've shared on this podcast before, it's a big thing for me, especially like the first launch phase in the first 18 months of New City, was just not confident. Like, what if somebody asks this, what if this goes wrong, whatever, because you're not going to know everything, and that's the thing. Like, but you still have to make a decision oftentimes, you still have to do things. And so there's a tension of being confident, but also being humble, being willing to learn and to grow. But at the end of the day, like, a decision has to be made. Like, we have to decide what we're going to do with this. And what I found is either you can be too confident and prideful, or you could be, humble's not the right word, maybe prideful in the other way. Like, you're just too afraid to make a decision, which you can't lead if you can't do that. And so for me, I've really had to, all of these, but this one's especially the first few years of New City, is learning what does it look like to be confident in what we're doing and actually going for things, but also being humble and willing to take feedback and criticism.
I think this one, this is just these all are, but this one especially is a leadership lesson in regardless of what capacity you're in, whether you're in church or somewhere else. And I've said this before on the podcast, and I think we agree that I think this is one that you could really benefit from having some leadership experience outside of planting your church, like, or previous to planting your church. Because some of these things, it's, if you've never experienced this before, if you've never experienced, having to make decisions and then having a lot of people push back on them and having to be confident in them, when you believe, if you've never experienced any of that before, even on a smaller scale, it's going to be real tough to deal with that for the first time when planting a church, because that's your child, that's like your thing. This isn't just like you're in leadership in a company. This is like your thing. So for it to be the first time you're ever dealing with this is going to be real tough. So I think with this one, really with all these, I would say to having some experience in leadership, not necessarily, it doesn't have to be a huge capacity or spend decades doing it, but some leadership experience before doing this really helps kind of prep you for dealing with these in church planning where they might be more intensified.
Yeah, that's good. Now, again, we didn't really give you answers on how to do all these, but these are just things to be thinking of, to be considering as you're going about your time as a church leader, because if we manage these things better, it'll make us leaders. I think if we forget some of these things, we can get into errors. And so, again, the 4 are innovating for the future while honoring the past, sticking to your convictions while empathizing with those who disagree, making the best decision while being misunderstood, and being confident in what you are doing while being humble enough to continue to grow.
Yep.
So thanks for listening today. Again, if you're new with us, make sure you hit subscribe and share it. Why don't you share it with some other ministry friends?
Just share it.
Just share it so we can plant and grow healthy churches together.
That's right, together.
And we'll be with you next time on Practical Church Planning. Thanks so much for watching this episode of Practical Church Planning. Whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube or Practical Planning, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, make sure you like or subscribe or do whatever it's telling you to do or should do on that platform.
And hey, if you are so tired of looking at our ugly faces, but you're not tired of listening to our beautiful voices, then you can find our podcast if you just search Practical Church Planning on iTunes or Google Play. Make sure not to just find it, not just to listen, but to subscribe.
Make sure you subscribe. Brian, tell them to subscribe.
Subscribe.
See you next time.